Hello! Welcome to the second part of my video by request about the history of our notation system. In this part, I'll be talking about how rhythm was gradually added in as a new element of notation from about the 12th to the 14th centuries. We have a lot to talk about, so we should get right to it. First, I just want to remind you about the episode playlist. I'll be talking about some pretty interesting music in this video, so if you want to hear some of it, just follow that link in the description. All right, let's get to it. I'm Peter, and this is Something About Music. Now, as far as anyone's been able to tell so far, there is no systematic way of communicating information about rhythm in the notation from this era. And this has led to a lot of debate about just how rhythm was used. One idea is that every note is simply sung rhythmically equally, like you usually hear Gregorian chant performed today. Another possibility is that every syllable is rhythmically equal. This would lead to a much more virtuosic and rhythmically exciting version of a lot of the same music. It's probable that people had a pretty flexible approach to rhythm that included both of these ideas and other things like dance rhythms or specific rhythmic patterns that were communicated orally. One place where we can say a little bit more is a particular style of polyphonic music that became popular in the 12th century called Organum. There's a pretty widely held misconception, for which generations of well-meaning music history teachers are probably to blame, that polyphony is a relatively new invention from the late medieval period. Actually, there is literally no reason to believe this. As I mentioned earlier, one of the very first discussions of music making in medieval Europe that we even have talks about polyphony. That ancient Babylonian hymn that I mentioned earlier is also polyphonic. It is, however, true that there seems to have been an increasing emphasis on polyphony in education during the era immediately following Guido. This became even more pronounced in the 12th century as centers of education moved from rural monasteries to urban cathedral schools, some of which eventually combined to form the first universities. It's probably for this reason that polyphony seems to have been the major driver of new developments in notation from this point on, and so it will be at the center of our story moving forward. From the 11th and 12th centuries, we have quite a few sources of polyphony, and in them there are basically two kinds of music featured. The first is called discant, and that's where you basically take a chant and harmonize it note against note. The second is organum, and that involves stretching out the chant and then accompanying it with a much more fast-moving line of music. This idea of holding out the chant is where we get the word tenor, from the Latin word for hold. Fortunately, we have several books that talk about how to perform organum, and in them it's made pretty clear that the notes in the fast-moving line that are consonant, according to the rules of the time, with the chant, are held longer, while the notes that are dissonant should be shorter. In most cases, this results in a rhythm that a student of classical poetry would call trochaic, that is, tum-ta-tum-ta-tum-ta-tum. And one place where this absolutely would have been noticed was at the brand new University of Paris, where the next part of our story takes place. The University of Paris was founded gradually over the course of the 12th century through a combination of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame with a few others in the area. It wasn't the very first European university. That title belongs to Bologna. But the University of Bologna was basically a training center for bureaucrats and lawyers working in the Vatican. So Paris tended to be where the exciting stuff happened. This is especially true in music, and from the 12th through at least the 14th centuries, the University of Paris was basically the place to be for anyone interested in the cutting edge of what was happening in music. Not coincidentally, it's also the site of basically all of the developments we'll be talking about from here on out. We know from a few scattered sources and from people complaining about it that there was some very elaborate music making happening at Notre Dame even before the university had coalesced. But it's really in the later decades of the 12th century that things reached a level of elaboration and ambition that had never been approached before. And it's from this moment that we have the very first method of how to communicate information about rhythm in notation. We actually have a little bit of an inside look into this world from what seem to be the notes of a student who attended the university about 50 years after all this happened. He gives us the names of two composers who supposedly were active in this so-called Notre Dame school. These are Leonin and Perottin. The first of these names bears a striking resemblance to Leonius, who was a pretty important poet operating at the university around the same time. If Leonius and Leonin turned out to be the same person, this would make a lot of sense for our story. Of course, it would also be a pretty good creation myth for this style, so I wouldn't necessarily take it at face value. I won't go into too much detail here about the style of music these people were making. Suffice it to say that the presumably earlier two-voice examples that tend to be associated with Leonin basically amount to organum stretched to ridiculous proportions and interspersed with little moments of discant. It's in these little discant moments that the issue of rhythm really comes up. As I mentioned earlier, organum, as it was apparently typically performed, involved this tump-ta-tump-ta-tum trochaic rhythm. Leonin, or someone else, apparently wanted to get some of that rhythm into the discant sections as well, so they came up with a little trick called modal rhythm that basically amounts to the concept of poetic meter transferred directly into music. The important thing to know about modal rhythm is that it doesn't involve any kind of new note shapes or anything like that. Everything looks pretty much just like earlier music. It also has no direct connection between any particular shape of note and any duration. Everything is communicated through the context of how notes are tied together in ligatures. To give you an example, if you see a line of music that begins with 3 notes tied together and then proceeds in groups of 2, this can be read as that dum-da-tum-da-tum rhythm. On the other hand, if you see a line that begins with a group of 2 and ends with a group of 3, that is a ta-tum-ta-tum-ta-tum iambic rhythm. Eventually, the system was expanded to include all 6 of the typical classical meters, but some of these seem to have been purely theoretical and don't pop up in any example that survives. There are also several pieces for 3 and even 4 voices, which are usually associated with Perottin and the later generation of Notre Dame composers. These pieces are very significant for our story because they seem to be the first pieces of music we know of that were originally conceived of as written compositions, as opposed to being pieces that were composed within an oral tradition and then only written down later. They also feature a whole lot more modal rhythm, because when you're dealing with 3 or 4 voices, it suddenly becomes necessary to regulate the rhythm all the time, not just at key moments. Modal rhythm caught on and was pretty popular throughout the 13th century, but it does have some issues. First of all, it's really mainly good for rhythms that repeat over and over again, like the rhythm of a poem. There's some flexibility. You can throw in decorative notes or even change up the rhythm in the middle of a line if you want to, but it gets pretty cumbersome pretty fast. An even bigger problem is that because it depends on ligatures, modal rhythm is really only good for music that's melismatic. Now, Notre Dame Polyphony is about as melismatic as any musical style ever, so that worked out pretty well. But there was a new style on the horizon, the Motet, which basically, and often literally, amounted to a piece of Notre Dame organum with a whole lot more text thrown in. This is pretty similar to the trend in chant that I mentioned a little while ago, and similarly, it also resulted in pieces of music having to be written out twice in order to know how to perform them. This was obviously a problem, And the solution that someone came up with to this problem is where we finally have the beginning of our modern rhythmic notation system. This is what's typically referred to as Franconian notation. It's called that because it was written about in a book by a guy named Franco of Cologne, who, despite his name, was associated with, you guessed it, Paris University. He probably didn't invent it. It was in use for a while before the book was written, but he definitely helped to popularize it. This is the first notation system that we know of where the idea of differently shaped notes standing for different rhythmic values came into play. If we limit ourselves for the moment to thinking about individual notes, the way this operates is fairly straightforward. What the people who created this system have done is simply take the three main note shapes that existed in the notation of the time and assign to each a different value, making them the long, the breve, and the semi-breve, which, if you're American like me, you probably know better as a whole note. The way that these values relate to each other, though, is a little bit more complicated, because this system assumes that notes always fall into groups of 3 beats. This means that if you have a long followed by a breve, it can usually be read as 2 plus 1. But if you have 2 longs together, they would be read as 3 plus 3. Where this gets to be a bit confusing is when you have a long followed by 2 breves, in which case, in order for it to add up to groups of 3, one of the breves has to be 2 beats, meaning that a breve in one context could be equal to a long in another. Things get even crazier when ligatures get involved, and I'll tell you just a little bit about how that works, mainly because I think it's really cool. So, in the notation that existed up until this time, there were 2 basic forms of 2-note ligature. The pes, for when the melody's going up, and the clivis, for when it's going down. Both of these shapes pop up all the time in modal rhythm, and just by virtue of the way modal rhythm works, they almost always stand for the same combination of notes, a breve followed by a long. Franconian notation just makes this relationship official and then uses it as a starting point. Any change to the shape means a change to the rhythm. So if you change the first note, either by adding a stick to the pes or taking it away from the clivis, you end up with 2 longs. If you change the second note, either by nudging it to the side in the pes or blending it in the clivis, you end up with 2 breves. If you make both changes, you end up with a long followed by a breve. You can also throw more notes in between, and all of them will just be read as breves. So clearly this system succeeded in solving the problem that it was meant to solve, and brought along a lot of other possibilities on top of that. But it was limited by the fact that it was designed to work with a specific style of music, and so, as styles shifted, it inevitably became less perfectly suited to dealing with them. Already by the end of the 13th century, this was starting to become a problem. At the time, there was a trend of making the top line of a piece of music move much more quickly than the tenor. Sometimes Franconian notation just didn't have enough note values to deal with this. Some composers, most notably a possible student of Franco's named Petrus de Cruce, dealt with this problem by making the smallest note value, the semibreve or whole note, a flexible entity. In pieces from this time, you might see groups of anywhere from 2 to 9 semibreves equaling the value of 1 breve. This was a solution, but it wasn't the most elegant because it could create some ambiguity. And anyway, the cat of rhythmic notation was out of the bag at this point, and some musicians were wanting a system that would work with all music, or at least all music they were exposed to. Early in the 14th century, that is exactly what they got from 2 musicians who were also mathematicians, Jean de Meur and Philippe de Vitry. Exactly how de Meur and de Vitry's musical innovations related to their mathematical work and to the work of their collaborator, Levi ben Gershom, a Jewish mathematician who worked for the Pope, could be a good topic for an extra nerdy video in the future. For now, I'll try to keep things simple. To deal with the problem I mentioned before, they created a new smaller note value, the minim, which you might know as a half note. Within another generation or two after, the system had been expanded even farther to include the semi-minim, also known as a quarter note or crotchet. And from that point, it was a relatively simple matter to add new, smaller note values as need arose over the next few centuries. They also dealt with what to me is the most glaring problem with Franconian notation. The fact that it's only good for writing music in triple meter, even though we know there was a lot of music in 2 at the time. They dealt with this problem by creating what we would call a time signature, using notation that was very likely borrowed from the business world. It worked like this. The outer circle, or broken circle, told you in modern terms how many beats there were in a measure. The presence or absence of a dot, or sometimes a third dot, in the middle told you how those beats should be broken up. So a circle with a dot would be 3 groups of 3, similar to our modern time signature 9/8. A broken circle with no dot would be 2 groups of 2, similar to 2/4. The difference is that there's no indication that this system told you anything about accents as the modern one does. That's probably why there was no need for a distinction between 2/4 and 4/4. The broken dotless circle is still with us today and often used as a shorthand for 4/4. The idea that this is a C standing for common time is a folk etymology that was come up with after the fact to explain it after this earlier system had been mostly forgotten. There are a few other ways in which this system is different from the modern one, but all of the ingredients were essentially in place at this time. And it was finally more or less true, as Jean de Meur triumphantly stated, that whatever could be sung could now be written down. Before I close, I should quickly say a few words about a topic I haven't addressed at all so far, which is rests. Going back to the time of modal rhythm, or even before that, you sometimes see little lines written across the staff to indicate that a pause should take place. Interestingly enough, these lines evolved in one direction to become what we now know as bar lines, and simultaneously in another to become rests. In Franconian notation, they started to use different lengths of these lines to show how long a rest should be. The shortest version of that was eventually stylized into both the whole rest and the half rest that we have today. When quarter notes came into use, a little backward 7 that's probably based on a shepherd's crook was adopted to be its equivalent rest. This was used for a very long time. You can even see examples from the 19th century. But because it was the exact reversal of an 8th rest, it could be confusing to look at. Probably for this reason, someone came up with an idea of combining 2 8th rests together to make a quarter rest, as you can see pretty clearly in this example from the 19th century. This was probably what was stylized into the squiggle that we have today, although it seems to have been very often written horizontally rather than vertically for quite some time. Okay, so that is basically the story of how we got our modern notation system. Now, I know that there are crescendos and slurs and accents and all kinds of other features that enrich the notation that we have today, and I didn't talk about any of that. But that will have to be a story for another day. For the meantime, stay healthy and happy, and don't forget to listen to some music now and then.